Hi, I'm Samuel C. Spitali, author of How to Win the War on Truth. In this video, we'll look at the truth about undocumented immigrants. The U.S. has long been a nation of immigrants. Over the course of the 20th century, we received more immigrants than any other nation in the world. Yet in spite of this, or perhaps because of it, the U.S. also has a long history of xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. In the 1840s, anti-immigrant ire was aimed at German and Irish immigrants and Roman Catholics, resulting in America's first anti-immigrant political party, the Know Nothings. In the 1880s, anti-immigrant anger was directed toward the Chinese, so Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which limited Chinese immigration. In the 1920s, the same anti-immigrant refrain was directed at Italians, so Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, which set immigration quotas for non-Anglo-Saxons. In the 1930s, Americans used the same argument against Jews and even denied asylum to a ship of refugees who were forced to return to Europe, where many died in the Holocaust. In the 1940s, anti-immigrant ire was aimed at the Japanese, who were condemned to internment camps. And on and on. After 9/11, it was Muslims, and today it's Mexicans and migrants from South America. Regardless of where the migrants are from, Americans have labeled them threatening because they were poor, practiced a different faith, were non-white, were too numerous, were not assimilating, were taking jobs away from deserving Americans, were bringing crime and disease into the country, had dangerous political ideals, were un-American, or even hated America. These arguments have been used for centuries, recycled and applied to whichever minority is immigrating at any given time. But they are more myth than reality, especially those applied to undocumented immigrants at our southern border. For instance, undocumented immigrants are not bringing crime. They have substantially lower crime rates than U.S. citizens. In fact, studies show that violent crime rates decrease with the increase of immigrants in a population. When illegal immigration tripled to over 11 million between 1990 and 2013, the crime rate dropped. And following the influx of undocumented immigrants during the Biden presidency, the crime rate in the U.S. dropped again, and the homicide rate dropped even more. And even though right-wing media devote an inordinate amount of time to immigrants murdering American citizens, these are the exceptions, selected and hyped to give the impression that it's the norm. But they are only a tiny fraction of the crimes committed. According to studies, undocumented immigrants are 33 to 47% less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens, and they're 60% less likely to be incarcerated. After all, criminal conduct could lead to deportation. And after all they went through to get to the U.S., why would they risk it? Undocumented immigrants are not terrorists. In the last half-century, no Americans have been killed by a terrorist attack in the U.S. by someone who crossed the border illegally. In fact, studies on migration flows between 145 countries have shown that immigration correlates with a decline in terrorism. In 2009, the Department of Homeland Security issued a warning about what would become our greatest domestic terrorist threat: violent right-wing extremists. During the Trump presidency, FBI investigations into white supremacist and anti-government terrorism tripled, dwarfing the number of ISIS cases to become the number one threat in the U.S. Undocumented immigrants are not bringing drugs. 90% of drugs arrive to the U.S. through official ports of entry, not through illegal immigrants crossing the border. 86% of the people in the U.S. convicted of trafficking fentanyl are U.S. citizens, not immigrants. A border wall would not stop illegal immigration. Because migrants travel back and forth for harvest work, a border wall would prohibit them from returning home once they are done. When the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton White Houses increased border enforcement, it had the reverse effect, skyrocketing undocumented immigration by nearly 250%. As it got harder to go back and forth, people simply stopped trying and just remained in the U.S. In the last 10 years, 3.9 million of these temporary workers have circulated back and forth between the U.S. and Mexico. Immigrants are not stealing American jobs. The flow of undocumented immigrants into the country does not affect the unemployment rate. Undocumented immigrants tend to take jobs in the secondary labor market, such as agriculture, housework, and day labor, where wages are unregulated and subminimum and offer no room for advancement. By some estimates, illegal immigrants comprise as much as 70% of crop pickers, and in some U.S. cities, 70% of housekeepers. These jobs do not pay enough for an American family to survive, But for Mexicans who migrate between Mexico and the US, the dollar is worth more when they return home, where the cost of living is lower and they can live off $2 a day. And for American homeowners who need the house painted, the lawn mowed, or the toilets cleaned, hiring undocumented workers keeps their costs low or below industry rates. Immigrants are not a main contributor to the housing crisis. Several things are contributing to the U.S. housing crisis, including soaring home prices, a lack of housing in major cities, and private equity snapping up homes. We don't have enough housing at the moment for a number of reasons that include zoning policies by state and local governments make it more difficult to build homes. Private equity firms are buying up a significant amount of real estate, more than 1 in 10 homes sold over the past decade, twice the number before the 2008 housing crash. An increasing amount of homes being built are for rental units instead of home ownership. The percentage of new single-family homes under 1,400 square feet dropped from 70% in the 1940s to less than 10% in 2020. There are also supply chain issues such as labor shortages and even housing supplies due to overseas production challenges. And short-term rentals like Airbnb also limit the housing supply. Immigrants are not a drain on our resources. When immigrants are incorporated into the workforce, they pay taxes just like the rest of us. If they are undocumented without a social security number, they are ineligible to receive many benefits funded by the tax dollars they pay. Each year, undocumented immigrants pay an estimated $7 billion more in Social Security taxes than they take out, and $1.5 billion more into Medicare than they receive. Immigrants actually strengthen the economy because they become new consumers, spending their salaries on goods and services just like the rest of us, which expands the demand, which creates jobs. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the current surge in immigrants is estimated to bring in $1.2 trillion in federal revenue in the next decade due to income, payroll, and sales taxes. Meanwhile, the real drain on our resources comes from corporations. The federal government spends an estimated $170 billion a year on corporate welfare. 20 to 30% of the wealthiest corporations pay no taxes at all, and many receive subsidies paid for by taxpayers. And Republican administrations continually slash the corporate tax rate to please their corporate donors. The Trump tax cuts lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, leaving the working class to pick up 86% of federal revenue. In short, immigrants do not take our jobs. They do not come here to commit crimes or sell drugs. They migrate for political, social, and economic reasons, to escape war, poverty, or climate change. South Americans first began immigrating to the United States during the Cold War era, when countries such as Argentina, Chile, and Colombia experienced political upheaval, armed conflict, and economic instability. The same conditions in the Arab world that's led to the recent refugee crisis in Europe. If politicians were truly interested in solving the immigration debate, they would not be demonizing immigrants for political gain. Instead, they would punish businesses that hire them instead of punishing the immigrants. They would make businesses pay livable wages so all Americans can afford to do the work. They would legalize drugs so that government can regulate and control distribution, thereby crippling drug cartels. They'd battle climate change so that more global citizens are not forced to relocate. And they'd stop backing dictators in troubled countries in order to capitalize on their natural resources, and instead help them become more democratic, more equal, and sustainable. Politicians don't often focus on these actions because they are not interested in solving the problem. They are only interested in exploiting racial hostility for political power, a tactic that's worked for centuries in America. The KKK initially came to power by blaming poor non-white immigrants for stealing their jobs. Unfortunately, this has become a reliable political strategy. In 2013, Breitbart Steve Bannon, Senator Jeff Sessions, and GOP strategist Stephen Miller decided that instead of trying to bring their party's policies in line with changing demographics, they would rather appeal to the prejudices of the white working class. By demonizing immigrants, Bannon, Sessions, and Miller were convinced they could appeal to working class whites who were losing their jobs due to globalization and who could be persuaded that they were losing their country and their culture to immigrants. And it worked. When Trump made immigration a cornerstone of his campaign, his favorability jumped from 16% to 57%. A 2017 study found that fears about immigrants and cultural displacement were more powerful factors than economic concerns in predicting support for Trump among white working-class voters. But make no mistake, economic woes and immigration fears are intricately linked, as studies show that far-right political parties benefit most from periods of economic stress, winning popular support by blaming immigrants and minorities for the loss of prosperity. That's partly why our immigration problem remains unsolved. When migrant encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border hit a record high in 2022, President Biden repeatedly asked Congress for funding for border enforcement, which would include more Border Patrol agents, more immigration judges, detection technology at ports of entry, and addressing the root causes of migration, such as climate change and economic instability. Yet congressional Republicans not only refused repeatedly, but voted to cut customs and border protection funding and block passage of a bipartisan border security bill at the behest of Donald Trump, just so that they could campaign on the border crisis through the election. Peddling fears of undocumented immigrants is an easy way for wealthy elites to deflect attention away from themselves by pitting the working class against each other so they can't join forces against the elites who've rigged the economic system against them. So the next time you hear politicians spreading fears of immigration or complaining about the border crisis, notice if they are proposing solutions to address the root causes of migration, or if they're just trying to rile up people about the problem, tapping into unconscious racial bias to drive low-information voters to the voting booth. If you enjoyed this video or know someone who would benefit from watching it, please share. And to read more, be sure to check out my book, How to Win the War on Truth. Thank you for watching.